Talk up to tonight. My name is Ben Birnbaum. I am a special assistant to the president of Boston College and editor of Boston College Magazine. I'm very pleased to be the moderator here tonight, though from what I can tell from the panel, that only means I can keep people from challenging each other to a duel before the night's out. This is not going to be a terribly arduous job for me. I want to introduce the panel, and we are here tonight sponsored by the Church in the 21st Century Initiative and the Boise Center, and to talk about the future of religion in America through the lens of two particular books. And I want to introduce those authors first. Peter Steinfels, who is sitting second to my left, is a New York Times religion correspondent and has been a thoughtful contributor to Commonweal magazine since 1964 and was its editor from 1984 to 1988. He has published widely articles and books and has taught at Georgetown and the University of Notre Dame. And if BC ever asks him to teach here, he will complete the Catholic trifecta and perhaps be the first person to do so. His most recent book, which is the subject of tonight's talk, or a subject of tonight's talk, is called People Adrift, The Crisis of the Roman Catholic Church in America. And in spite of what Alan Wolfe intimated in his very favorable review in the New Republic, the title, I have it on Peter's good authority, was devised long before the present difficulties in the church became apparent, which makes Peter a truth teller of some import, or maybe even a prophet, I don't know. Alan Wolfe, who is sitting to Peter's left, is a professor of political science at Boston College and director of the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life. He is the author of 10 books, many of them award-winning, and of which the most recent and under discussion tonight is titled The Transformation of American Religion, How We Actually Live Our Faith, which makes the case that American culture is sweeter and stronger than all fundaments and orthodoxies put together. I happen to admire Alan's reviews and occasional essays, and so I'll mention another book of his that has recently come out, which is called An Intellectual in Public, and is a collection of those reviews and occasional essays. Sitting at the far end of the table is David Brooks, who began writing a twice-a-week column on the New York Times op-ed page in September. He is formerly a senior editor at the Weekly Standard, and as some of you may know, has been a gracious and witty talking head on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, to which he's going to return, I understand, and has been a contributing editor to a number of publications, including the Atlantic Monthly, where he invented red and blue states in America, which is one of those remarkably transparent conceits that will outlast us all. In fact, on the way in tonight, this is election day, though we don't quite know it in Massachusetts. This is election day across the country, and red and blue states were referenced twice in the 20 minutes it took me to drive from the restaurant to Boston College. He is also the author of the book Bobos in Paradise, The New Upper Class and How They Got There, a widely admired book that I've never read for fear it was about me. And he spent 9 years at the Wall Street Journal as a foreign correspondent, editor of its book review section, and also a movie reviewer. Wendy Kaminer, who's immediately to my left, is a lawyer, social critic, contributing editor to The Atlantic, and a senior correspondent for the American Prospect. Two adjectives that seem to follow her around the literature like large bodyguards are liberal and iconoclastic. Her books include A Fearful Freedom, Women's Flight from Equality, which is a critique of so-called victim feminism, and a critique of self-pity called I'm Dysfunctional, You're Dysfunctional, The Recovery Movement, and Other Self-Help Fashions. Her latest book is called Sleeping with Extraterrestrials, The Rise of Irrationalism and Perils of Piety. And I was interested to discover that one of those ubiquitous Amazon.com reviewers, a fellow, or maybe a woman, who calls himself or herself the Red Avenger from Hell, described Ms. Kaminer's newest book as, quote, a classic, a gem, the final word on religion.
all go home now.
Yes, right. We'll just have Wendy say a few words and then we'll leave. Scott Appleby, who is sitting next to my vacant chair over on the left. Actually, there's no vacant, excuse me. Next to Mr. Brooks on the left is the John M. Regan Jr. Director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame and a professor of history at the university. As a scholar and intellectual, he is probably best known for his work as co-director of the Fundamentalism Project, the most extensive study of essentialist faith known to man. He is also the author of several other books about the Catholic Church and about American culture. And he is co-author, if I can find the final sheet of paper here, of Transforming Parish Ministry, the Changing Roles of Clergy, Laity, and Women Religious. And far be it from me, as editor of Boston College Magazine, to say anything about Notre Dame Magazine, but Scott's recent essay there called A Catholic Rorschach Test is as fine a cri de coeur as any published by an American Catholic in the last 2 bitter years. I can only say we would have published it in Boston College Magazine if he'd asked, and we, I have to say, would have come up with a better title. Please welcome our 5 panelists. The format for this evening is that Alan Wolfe will speak about his book for a short time. Then Peter Steinfels will speak about his book. Our 3 respondents will then join in, and we hope to engage in a conversation among the panelists for some time, and then turn the conversation to you and have you address the panelists from the audience. There are 2 microphones, I understand, up there, which you can speak into. I ask you to approach the microphones because this evening is also being filmed for something called Boston College Front Row, which is a streaming video service of Boston College and will be available on the Boston College website within the next month or so. So if there are people who wanted to be here tonight and couldn't be here, tell them they can see this again and again and again if they wish on Boston College Front Row shortly. Now, Alan Wolfe, thank you.
I'd like to at least give Peter the opportunity to defer to him to speak first, since he's our honored guest, if that's...
Actually, the panel is seizing control here. Yeah, we voted that I'll do the lead off here. And I'll lead off with the very first sentence of the introduction to A People Adrift, which is, today the Roman Catholic Church in the United States is on the verge of either irreversible decline or a thoroughgoing transformation. And the reason I kind of like beginning with that sentence is that there's an irony in the fact that I'm in effect calling for transformation there, the word which is the key word in the title of Ellen's book, The Transformation of American Religion. And yet when I thought about it, I recognized that not a small part of what Ellen describes as transformation, I seem to be worrying about as decline. So we can approach that later on. I think that's an interesting element here. Actually, not only did I write the title in 1997, but I wrote that first sentence in 1997, long before, 5 years before, the sex abuse scandals and revelations about them shook the foundations of American Catholicism. I'll try and sketch very quickly the basic argument of my book. I hope some of you will look at it anyway, but basically it's this. One, there are 2 major internal changes that American Catholicism is undergoing now and must deal with. Those are the transition of leadership at every level of church life, from the parish to institutions of higher learning, from essentially priests, the ordained, and secondly, members of religious orders, the vowed, to lay people. Secondly is a generational change from Catholics who were formed in a highly defined, tightly bounded, often ethnically based Catholicism that was typical of the Church in the United States before the landmark Second Vatican Council, to Catholics who came of age in perhaps the most tumultuous years of an exciting, wide open, but often unstable Catholicism. Point two, the Church also faces two massive external changes in our culture. The first one of which turns on the growing human ability to separate sexual intercourse from procreation, and consequently a very different understanding of human sexuality. The second external change is a global movement recognizing the equality and dignity of women, and consequently their right to public roles from which they've previously been excluded. Point three, all these changes, the two internal and the two external, are irreversible, in my opinion. Though that does not in itself determine the choices that Catholicism must make or the outcomes that it will face. Perhaps of the four, the most debatable one is whether the decline in the number of priests and the transition, therefore, of church leadership from the ordained to the laity is really irreversible. I make a complicated argument as to why I think it is. Obviously, the other internal change, the generational shift, you can't turn the hands on the clock of time backwards, so that's clearly irreversible. And I would argue that the two external changes, a new understanding of human sexuality arising from new control over human fertility, and a new understanding and recognition of the role of women in public roles and their fundamental equality and dignity, are world historical shifts, and neither of those are going to be reversed. Point four, Catholic leadership is failing to deal with these two internal and two external challenges, and not just at the level of the hierarchy, whose shortcomings have been painfully exposed, but at the level so far of all kinds of other elite and leadership groups in the Church. And this failure so far, I'll say a relative failure, I don't want to be too blanket here, is due to a state of polarization and hardened camps in the Catholic Church, resulting in suspicion and so on that have really arisen over the last 4 decades since the debates that were so important at the time of and following the Second Vatican Council. Point five, while I have my own proposals, I will outline my own proposals, for some of them for dealing with these issues. In the area of politics, I think that the Church in America should pursue the consistent ethic of life position, but clearly restating the distinction, well-grounded in Catholic tradition, between the Church's duty to speak to fundamental moral principles and the responsibility of political leaders to apply them prudently. Secondly, in the area of institutions, this vast network of institutions that it's been the genius of American Catholicism to create, from parochial schools to the hospital and health care, higher education, social services, and so on. I make an argument for the need to deliberately, intentionally preserve and renew a distinctive Catholic identity in those, resisting the trends towards secularization. This, I think, is a task that can be done in accord with American pluralism, although it can't be done simply by orders from the top down. I make recommendations about the need to focus on the quality of worship and catechetics and adult faith formation as the highest of priorities, with demanding assessments in those areas and investments of resources. I believe the Church should revisit the encyclical Humanae Vitae and the absolute ban on contraception. I believe that married men should be ordained to the priesthood, that women should be ordained to the diaconate, and that the church should encourage serious theological discussion of ordaining women to the priesthood rather than penalizing it. Finally, I make recommendations about opening the selection of bishops, the place of greater transparency, democratic procedures, and checks and balances at all sorts of levels in church life. Now, I recognize that this is actually a moderate liberal part. This position puts me in the moderate liberal part of the spectrum of Catholic opinion, but I make the argument that that part does not contain all wisdom, that conservative complaints about Catholic identity and Catholic institutions, conservative complaints about liturgical renewal, catechetics, and the dangers incumbent on separating sex and procreation, that there are many points that have been raised in connection with those complaints that liberals have too often ignored, even if I myself may not agree with the remedies that go with those complaints. So my final point, point 6 in summarizing the book, is that there is a need to address issues in order to escape from this hardened camps that I think is paralyzing church decision-making today. There's a need to address issues with an idea to practical pastoral realities rather than, as is so often the case, the escalation of differences in pastoral judgments to high-stakes doctrinal disputes and over matters of conflict. I've argued that we need to spend a little less time debating the theology of hymn lyrics and actually a little more time checking how many people in the congregations have their lips moving. I guess that this final point is a good place to turn over the discussion because it really does, I think it reveals a common spirit at that point between my book and Alan's book, which is the need to look to see what people are actually doing rather than the abstract arguments of theoretical propositions that so often dominate our discussions about religion. I'd also, one other very important common points, I think, in our two treatments is, at least in my belief, that Catholicism needs to be much more aware of the experience of others, of other religious groups, particularly in the United States. Just one small example. I'm always amused by the discussions we have about other ways to select bishops and people who would like to see wider participation of church members in that selection will point to the acclamation of Ambrose as Bishop of Milan in the 5th century. Someone can correct me on that. No one ever thinks of going down the street to seeing how the Methodists or the Episcopal Church actually selects its bishops, although the Episcopal Church's efforts at doing so is somewhat in the public eye these days. But I think we do need, both on these levels, to turn to genuine grassroots experience, and this is a point in which I think it's appropriate for me to pass the baton to Alan.
Well, thanks for passing the baton. Peter and I have known each other a long time, and it's a great privilege and honor for me to acknowledge that we've both published books at roughly the same time that to some degree overlap. I noticed that he used the word transformation at the beginning of his book, and I noticed that that was the title of my book. There I have to say, though, that the coincidence is somewhat arbitrary, or if you want, God-given, because transformation wasn't my title. It was one of those incredibly intense negotiations with the editor that wound up with a neutral word that neither of us liked, but at least passed the muster of all the various committees that at one point or another thought my book might actually sell and therefore wanted to have some kind of title that would resonate in some way. So we went through taming, we went through dumbing down. They wanted dumbing down. I wouldn't have anything to do with it. Taming, I also thought was, the taming of American religion, I wasn't happy with. We finally wound up with transformation. But I think Peter's right to see in that title at least a suggestion of the idea of decline, although I didn't want to take a position on whether religion is in a state of decline in America or not, because in many ways I didn't see that that was my purpose, that I was in no position really to make that kind of judgment, and not being a religious person myself, and not writing from the perspective of what many people who write about religion address, which is its overall health in the rest of the society. I was much more interested in trying to get a kind of snapshot of what religion is actually like for people in conditions of real life. Now, that wasn't just a pure sociological curiosity. It wasn't just that I wanted to read every account I could get my hands on of what it's like to worship, or what it's like to be in a small group, or what it's like to go to a Promise Keepers rally in a large stadium. And it wasn't just that I wanted to do some of those things myself. It's not purely an anthropological journey into the world of religion. I certainly, as a political scientist, had a larger interest in what I wanted to find there, what I hoped to find there, and what I did find there, because there's a big political debate in the United States, as you all know, about the role of religion and the role that religion should play in our life. I would summarize that huge debate in the interest of brevity by saying that for many people in America, what's important about religion is that it has certain countercultural elements. I don't mean counterculture the way that term was used in the 60s and 70s to describe dropouts from society. I mean it more in the way the theologian David Tracy talks about it, as religion as an exercise in resistance. That religion is important to the degree that it runs against, that it's in friction with or in tension with the dominant culture, that it offers an alternative to either the materialism or the secularism or the lack of moral seriousness of the culture, and in that sense can offer something different to people, a vision of a different, a better world, a world that's different from the world around us. It's a point of view that's held by many people across the spectrum. Secular sociologists who write about religion often treat religion as countercultural, in the sense that they believe that our dominant culture is a modern culture, and that there's something pre-modern or anti-modern about religion, and that's what makes it different. And many people who write on behalf of religion also see it as countercultural, as prophetic, as standing in a position of judgment on the society and holding the society up to a different kind of standard. I raise the question in my book, however, that however important it may be for American religion to have countercultural aspects to it, how countercultural can it really be when American culture itself is enormously powerful? Certainly religion is a very, very powerful phenomenon. Certainly culture is a very, very powerful phenomenon. And I guess my book addresses the question of what happens when these two huge forces, both of which are powerful, both of which influence human behavior, what happens when they come into conflict with one another, which they frequently do. And the general answer in my book is that on one occasion after another, culture generally tends to win. Culture, American culture, shapes religion more, I think, than religion shapes American culture. And I try to illustrate that by looking at various aspects of the way religion is actually practiced in our society. Because I do think, and this is where I definitely agree that Peter and I address similar kinds of themes, that we definitely need to have a sense of what religion means to religious people. So I organize my book by different aspects of religious practice. How do people worship? What do they believe? What role does tradition play in the way they act out their faith? Morality, sin, how do they witness their faith? These are the various dimensions of religious practice that I explore. I'm not going to summarize them. I'll just give you a few sort of highlights from the book. For example, in my chapter on belief, I raise the question of while it is certainly true that religions generally come with sets of creeds, with beliefs, with theologies, with statements about what makes one particular religion different from others, with histories and with traditions that are embodied in ideas about the nature of God and the nature of the world. Americans generally, and we certainly see this in politics, are not all that knowledgeable about things outside their private lives and the lives of the communities. We generally don't know much about politics. We don't know much about history. We're not the most intellectual of cultures. We don't feature books like Peter and my book on every single show on nightly television, as ought to happen in a decent and rational society. But we're confined to the News Hour with Jim Lehrer if we're lucky. That is countercultural, but that's another story. But we live in some ways in a society in which our culture doesn't pay all that much importance to specifics, to details, and so on. And so how is it possible for Presbyterians to know the elements that go into what makes someone a Presbyterian, to the traditions, or Methodists to know about the founder of their faith and who he was and why he was important, or what really were the differences between Calvin and Luther, which I'm not sure I always understand, and I've tried to study this. We live in a society in which 10% of Americans think that Joan of Arc was Noah's wife, which is, I think, an ingenious, Ark, Noah, it kind of makes a certain amount of intuitive sense. And you wonder why it isn't more than 10%, but nonetheless, I'm not in any way, I hope, trying to sound superior. I'm just actually am impressed by the way in which religion in our society flourishes in ways that don't presuppose a substantial amount of theological knowledge and a substantial amount of knowledge about different creeds and when they were fashioned and what they mean and what they contain. Also, in a similar way, I talk a lot about tradition. And in my chapter on tradition, I especially talk a lot about American Jews, because tradition is so important for Judaism in a way that belief is so important for Christianity. For Jews, tradition in many ways is the faith, and it is the religion. And yet our society, as I don't need to tell you, is a society that chews up traditions and is constantly transforming them. And our society is actually a society that can have a television station called ESPN Classic, in which the classic game happened 3 weeks ago. Because I've seen that actually a number of times, in fact. So we are a society of the new, and we're constantly reinventing and redefining our traditions. In my chapter on tradition, I talk a lot about a particular Jewish believer who talks about the importance of the unbroken chain of tradition in Judaism, and she's experiencing a ritual called an adult bat mitzvah. And I say that the bar mitzvah, the tradition of calling a boy to the Torah at the age of 13, is by God a real tradition. It goes back to about the 13th century, and that's pretty good as traditions go. I have no complaint with that. The idea of calling women to the Torah, the bat mitzvah, is a tradition that goes back to 1922, when an American rabbi named Mordecai Kaplan called his daughter to the Torah. The idea of calling someone to the Torah as an adult rather than a 13-year-old goes back to an episode of the Dick Van Dyke Show, when someone came in and said, "Rabbi, I never had my bar mitzvah." And the rabbi, "Oh, you never? Let's have a bar mitzvah now." And so here's this person who's undergoing an adult bat mitzvah talking about the unbroken link and the unbroken chain. And I think there's something very appealing to me in that story, because it certainly indicates a strong emphasis and value on tradition, but at the same time takes place in our very non-traditional society. And finally, I talk a lot about American evangelicals. Evangelicals are, in many ways, among our most conservative of all religious believers. Politically, evangelicals are indeed very conservative, and their increased involvement in American politics has sharply shifted American politics to the right. And there's a sense that because of their conservatism and because of their moral traditionalism, that we would think of evangelicals as being the one true countercultural religion in America, the one that really stands up against the culture. But in fact, the very term born-again Christian, if you think about it for a moment, suggests how non-traditional evangelicals really are. Tradition means that you're born into something, that you inherit something, and that you pass it on to someone else. To be born again is, in a sense, to rebel against tradition. It's to value authenticity. It's to value a personal relationship with the Lord over tradition. And if any good evangelical were asked, what's more important, to simply inherit your belief in God or to experience your belief in God through a rebirth, it would obviously be the rebirth, which, whatever one thinks about it, is anything but traditional. And I think a good portion of my book concentrates on evangelicals. I argue in the book that, in a sense, we are all evangelicals now, that all American religions, including, I'm afraid to say, American Catholicism and American Judaism, increasingly come to resemble the evangelical emphasis on a personal relationship with God, on a religion that expresses an individual sense of empowerment and an individual's desire to worship and honor God in ways that make sense to that person and that give that person a sense that they are a participant in fashioning their own religious experience. One of the surprising things to me about the reception of my book is that while a certain newspaper called the New York Times, which has reviewed most of my books, in fact, Wendy reviewed the previous one to this one in the New York Times, they haven't reviewed this one, but the evangelical world has, in great numbers. Cal Thomas, an evangelical writer, a writer of evangelical views, Albert Mohler, the president of one of the most important conservative Protestant seminaries, wrote a review. Christianity Today has taken up the book, and talk radio, the sort of hard Christian right talk radio, and they all love my book, all of them. I go on these really heartland radio programs, which, my God, I never thought I would ever listen to one, let alone be a guest on one. And they can't stop praising my book because they think that I've said to the world that evangelicalism has gone soft. And these are fundamentalists, and they want to believe that evangelicals have gone soft because they want evangelicals to reject a lot of the things like mega churches and small group worship and high-tech websites and so on that have become the cutting edge of evangelical efforts to reach out to what evangelicals call the unchurched, which also includes the unsynagogued and the unmosqued. Unmasked, there's a new... I'm going to unmask you. I can just see it happening. I don't know exactly how I feel about being a hero to very right-wing conservative Protestants, but I guess if it helps sell the book, well, there's probably some advantages to that. Is what I describe represent a state of decline for American religion? As I said, I try not to address that question. It's kind of inevitable, though, and my answer is yes and no. I certainly think that if what I'm describing is true about American religion, that American religion has lost something. It lost something important. It's lost a prophetic voice to some degree. It has lost this countercultural friction that enables it to stand up and resist the culture. At the same time, I think it's made tremendous gains in religious tolerance, in pluralism, in the ability of people to live alongside one another in a country that does separate church and state, although it's never separated church and culture, and has allowed us, I think, to find ways. I mean, after all, if American religious believers switch their faith as often as I find that they do, it kind of is a guarantee against intolerance, because if you don't know what religion you're going to join 5 years from now because you had joined another one 5 years previously, you better not say anything negative about what you might become, let alone what your children might bring home. On the whole, then, I'm an optimist about religion in America. I see religion in America as subject to the same dynamics of transformation that have transformed American music, American sports, American politics, and they will also work their way into American religion. In our particular society, at this particular time, I think we're basically better off because of them. Thank you.
I'm going to address Alan's book with no disrespect to Peter. As I told Peter, I try only to talk about things that I know, or at least know a little bit, and I don't know much of anything about Catholicism. And I'd like to elaborate on the crossover between American religion, American religious practice, and self-help movements, the personal development tradition that Alan has talked about in his book. As I've told him, reading this very interesting book, I had a strong sense of déjà vu, because so much of what he finds in American religious practice today is very similar to what I saw when I was looking at personal development movements over 10 years ago. Now, that's hardly surprising, since, as he said, he's looking at the cultural influence on religion, and in particular, he's looking a lot at the influence of self-help movements. It's also not surprising because historically, personal development traditions have themselves drawn very heavily from religion. There has always been quite a lot of crossover between religion and popular therapies in this way. If you just look at the recovery movement, for example, its notions of addiction and recovery look very much like religious ideals of sin and redemption. Still, it's pretty striking to see established religious communities, and especially conservative religious communities, appropriating the teachings of the personal development tradition, because conservatives have vigorously derided this tradition for some time. And again, the similarities are striking when Alan quotes evangelicals saying, faith is too important to let religion get in the way. I hear very strong echoes of New Agers who talk about spirituality and talk about how spirituality is much too important to be left to the devices of organized religion. When I read that evangelicals care more about feeling than doctrine, I'm reminded of the remarks of people in codependency groups some years ago who would talk about the authenticity of their emotions and their feeling realities, and who were very derisive of intellectualism. Now, perhaps I should, or maybe I shouldn't add, that as a secular person, when I hear people say that they prefer feelings over doctrine, that makes a lot of sense to me, because from my perspective, the doctrine seems all fabricated anyway. But I think it does tell you something about the move towards emotion and towards a sense that authenticity comes from personal experience and personal emotion. And that has been very much a part of the personal development tradition for, I don't know, about a century. Now again, this crossover is very striking, because there has been a fair amount of hostility from evangelicals towards New Age, towards personal development, pop therapies. In the 1990s, when secularism was under attack and politicians left and right were very aggressively declaring their godliness, the personal development movements were lambasted for their relativism, for their self-centeredness. They were blamed for so much of what was wrong with American civilization. They were part of our decline. They were associated with fuzzy-headed liberals and feminists, and in fact, the personal development tradition itself was partly blamed for what was called the feminization of American culture. So when I critiqued the personal development movements in the early 1990s, I actually often found a much more receptive audience among conservatives than liberals. I know how Alan feels when he's invited on very conservative radio programs. The early 90s, you may remember, the presidential election pitted Bill Clinton, who was very emotive, very familiar with the rhetoric of codependency and recovery, pitted him against the old-fashioned Republican George Bush, who came from a time when real men didn't get on the couch, much less break down in support groups. Clinton was viewed by conservatives as emblematic of the self-absorbed baby boomers who made their personal development movements practically their religion. But now, as Alan says, personal development has become a very respectable and even a primary religious pursuit. And of course, it's interesting, if you look at our current president, son of the old-fashioned Republican, he's something of a graduate of the recovery movement. And in some ways, I see him as a kind of hybrid of his father and his father's nemesis, Bill Clinton. If you look at his personal story, it, in a way, demonstrates this marriage of religion and pop psychology. He recovers from alcohol abuse by finding God in a recovery group. Jesus was his sponsor. Now, this marriage of religion and pop psychology is not at all surprising, because it's not at all new. It dates back at least 100 years. Christian Science grew largely out of secular mind cure movements. In this century, in the 1950s, Norman Vincent Peale combined pop psychology and pop religion with enormous success when he wrote about the power of positive thinking, which has also always sort of straddled the line between religion and pop psychology. More recently, in the late 80s, early 90s, you found conservatives writing self-help books in the secular tradition. James Dobson from Focus on the Family, for example. There was a niche market for Christian recovery books. And these books were pretty interesting because they combined social conservatism with Christianity, with pop psychology, with critiques of pop psychology. They greatly denigrated American individualism and selfism at the same time that they extolled self-esteem, what else, and self-love, and told people that, you needed to love yourself in order to be able to really love God. They were borrowing from a lot of ideas about family interactions that came out of pop psychology. It was even said to be more important to love yourself than to love your neighbor. God was presented as a really good parent, an excellent parent, and Satan, of course, was a really bad parent who inflicted evil upon the world through the personality disorders that he inflicted upon people. Now, it's always hard to know how much people internalize the messages that they pick up from popular literature, which is why Alan's work is so very important, because it does suggest to us that, at least to some extent, religious people really are practicing what self-help writers preach. Alan, I think, is both comforted and concerned by this development, and I share his ambivalence, because I agree with him that if people of different religions and different denominations can happily, peacefully coexist, if religious people draw from the secular world, we are much less likely to run into a kind of hard-edged sectarianism and religious bigotry. But on the other hand, I don't really see much of a need for another social movement that extols self-esteem and self-love. And I also share the concern about losing religion as a kind of counterweight to the shallowness and banality and self-centeredness of the personal development culture. And I say that as a secular person, as a non-religious person. I wouldn't want to see sin reduced to mere dysfunction. I think the tension between our notions of sin and dysfunction are interesting and healthy. Though I'm not sure in the end that we're going to lose sin, because I think that the self-centeredness that is likely to come from this appropriation of self-help ideals, I don't know that it's going to be matched by a decrease in judgmentalism. I see, and this is one of the things that struck me most about Alan's book, I see such a strong disconnect between the ethic of forgiveness, the empathy, the hesitancy to judge, the tolerance that he finds in religious communities, and the extraordinarily harsh political environment in which so many religious people act. I mean, if you listen to Justice Scalia, who is a deeply religious and I think also a deeply angry man, you really don't find much evidence of empathy or forgiveness or a hesitancy to judge. It may be, as Alan says, that Americans don't want an angry God when they worship, but a lot of Americans seem pretty angry themselves and pretty quick to judge harshly their opponents. So I suspect, and this is just my suspicion based on no research, that's the advantage of being a social critic and not a social scientist. You don't have to back up anything you say. I suspect that both secular and religious people alike tend to extend their non-judgmentalism primarily to the people they like, people with whom they identify. And there's nothing particularly empathetic about that. Empathy means extending yourself to people who seem very different from you. Now, I've never seen much evidence of encouragement of empathy in the very self-centered personal development tradition. Sometimes you see it in religion and sometimes you don't. As Alan says, religious people can very harshly judge secular people. I can tell you, if you want to get a lot of very judgmental hate mail, just write sympathetically about atheism. But I'm not suggesting that judgmentalism or hypocrisy are functions of religion. I think they're functions of human nature. There are a lot of angry militant atheists out there. Well, not a lot. There are some militant atheists out there who are very contemptuous of religion. Usually when we accuse somebody of being judgmental, we're basically saying that we don't agree with the judgments that he's made, or that he's making judgments about things that we think raise no moral questions. Because after all, we wouldn't want people to start making moral and ethical judgments. So that we might all agree that a preference for vanilla over chocolate ice cream does not raise any moral questions. But what about sexual preferences? Do they raise moral questions? There we might vehemently disagree. So we are all absolutists, and we are all relativists, depending on the subject at hand. And I guess that's why I don't see sin going away, the concept of sin going away anytime soon, though it is worth noting that Americans seem to have a great deal of confidence in their own essential goodness. Most of the polls that I've seen suggest that strong majorities of Americans expect to go to heaven. One 1997 survey said that only, I think, 15% expected to spend some time in purgatory. But at the same time, strong majorities, over 60%, believe in hell. You have to wonder who they think inhabits it. Thank you.
Well, I have a double oops here in that I've prepared more of a critique of Alan's book with some comments on Peter's, so the tone's a little bit different. And the second oops is that my one funny line was Joan of Arc being Noah's wife. So you're in for a grim ride, in other words. But I'll make it brief. I certainly don't disagree with the main thesis of Alan Wolfe's fine new book. It's a solid and eminently defensible argument. Indeed, in some ways, this argument has been building for about 25 years. There have been a series of books, beginning, I think, in 1979 with Peter Berger's book, The Heretical Imperative, which argued that we all live in such a culture of radical choice, we make so many choices every day, that in our religious life, we can't help but be radical individualists. So that was kind of the first salvo in this argument. Of course, the well-known Habits of the Heart by Robert Bellah talked about expressive individualism in 1986 and came up with that wonderful model of Sheilaism, who Bellah argued was the prototypical American religious person. She said, well, I'll get the details wrong, I was Presbyterian for a while, and I've got a little bit of that, and then I went on my Eastern mysticism phase, and I incorporated a little bit of that, and a couple months with Oprah, and I guess you put it all together, and it's my own little voice, my religiosity. Sheilaism is what Bellah called it. And then a series of other books, Vanishing Boundaries, about that Alan kind of lifts up the theme of denominational differences really don't count as much as they used to be. I happen to be born a Presbyterian or a Catholic or a Buddhist. It's an accident of birth. Does it really mean anything doctrinally? And then books like, in the 90s, Wade Clark Roof's A Generation of Seekers, which is also, so in some ways, to put this positively, Alan's book brings together a lot of research that's been done over the last 25 years about this culture of choice and expressive religiosity and so forth. Also, there are some elements in the book that are not new historically. For example, when he quotes the Pentecostal Jenny in her view that there's something fundamentally wrong with the idea that belief in Jesus Christ requires some form of instruction from a person of authority, a guardian, a schoolmaster, a learned divine. She doesn't say learned divine, but Nathan Hatch uses that term in describing the Second Great Awakening, in which the movement was throwing off authority, individual interpretation, and this is in the late 18th, early 19th century. So some of these themes are not brand new, and other of the themes have been building at least since the 60s. What is more strikingly original in Alan's book, I suppose, is that his framing of the decline of what he begins with the Jonathan Edwards old-style religion, or what he elsewhere refers to as strong religion, he takes this generally as good news, at least in the way I read the book, as a matter almost for rejoicing. American faith has met American culture, Alan announces early in the book, and American culture has triumphed. This, he says, is a welcome development. And this kind of conveniently reinforces the thesis of One Nation After All, his 1998 book, which argued that the polemicists on both sides of the culture war have it wrong. If you actually listen to middle-class Americans, Alan wrote at the time, you discover a tolerant citizenry, a non-judgmental ethos, and a respect for the right of each person and family to make their own moral choices. Not the sullen paranoia imagined by liberals ensconced in urban lifestyles or conservative talk show hosts who are stirring the ideological pot. So in the new book, Wolfe extends this let's just all get along together consensus to religion, the sense of a kind of middle ground that is benevolent, not contested, and even though there may be different names for these expressions of religiosity, they really have much more in common than what they differ in. So this is now extended to religion. If we recognize religion as it actually is, or at least as it's portrayed with some justice in the transformation of American religion, Allen says, quote, we will, I believe, be less likely to see ourselves divided into irreplaceable camps. There's more than a hint of an agenda in that statement for the book. This is someone who is a humanist, I would say, and someone who wants to bring people together, and this is something I hope we would all applaud. I'm not so sure that that agenda at times in the book doesn't frame it a certain way. It wouldn't be the first time in history that an author, myself and probably everyone on this panel included, didn't to some degree have to organize his or her material around what seemed to come out of the material as a dominant theme. Of course, the news about religion's thinning and the loss of some of its old-time cantankerousness is a bit easier to accept, perhaps, if one is, like Alan Wolfe, as he describes himself, I am not, never have been a person of faith. When it comes to religion, he says early in the book, in the acknowledgments, I hear no inner voice, I'm attracted to no supernatural explanation of everyday events, and I identify with no particular tradition. Unlike Alan, I am a person of religious faith, a cradle Catholic. Like him, I don't think I hear any inner voices most of the time, nor am I attracted to supernatural explanations of everyday events. But I do lament more than Alan seems to the depth of truth in his account, because I think something important in the American character as well as in American religion is lost to the extent to which American religion in its diversity and its robust independence has collapsed into what I read as a kind of bland homogeneity in which truth claims that transcend a liberal procedural consensus, these kind of truth claims are seen as a bit embarrassing and not accessible or not appropriate for the public realm. This kind of personal statement on my part is invited by Allen's urging to accept his news about what I would call the thinning of American religion, the low doctrinal content, the breaking up of the thick ethnic and communal bonds that religion helped to cement with a sense of the sacred, that this thinning of American religion is buoyantly, for the most part, good news. I'm not quite sure it is. The stakes in this game are perhaps higher for those in whom American religion has embedded what, at times at least, I feel to be a robust sense of commitment to family and community, and at least some slight resistance to everyday capitulation to the mere pragmatism, procedural efficiency, and expediency that we absorb so readily from our culture. What I'm saying here is that to the extent that I have any of this resistance stubbornly, I trace it as coming from my religious background. Allen would trace it elsewhere. Others would trace those kinds of resistances or independence from the larger culture to different sources. But in my case, I give credit to my Catholic upbringing, as ambiguously as I might feel about that at times, and it's certainly not, an uncritical story, but I nonetheless trace it to that. So when I see that weakening, I have pause. One need not share the pugnacity of Albert Mohler, whom Alan just mentioned, and whom he quotes toward the end of the book, who says, Islam ought to be intolerant and Christianity ought to be about conversion. And once you lose, which religions lose the validity of their faith claims, of their claims to truth, of their truth claims, the game is over. You don't need to be quite that pugnacious or fundamentalist leaning, I don't think, nor do you need to share the sense of resident alien status that someone like Stanley Hauerwas talks about. I'm a Christian and I'm a resident alien in this culture. To be a bit concerned from a more, I'd hope, moderate point of view that religion is losing, if Allen is right, the validity of its truth claims, even though those truth claims can lead to a lot of conflict and can be competing and are not unambiguously good things. Even Allen, on several occasions in the book, cannot hide his disdain, or at least his bemusement, and even at times a hint of alarm at the sheer casualness of mainstream religious attitudes and practices, and there are a lot of entertaining examples in the book. I'll just give a couple. In discussing worship light, fellowship light, doctrine light, he comes close to asking many times, do we really want to call this religion in any sense? Quote, since attracting people is what megachurches do, Don raises an important question. What exactly is taking place in the sanctuaries they fill? Sanctuary being a term, of course, that they've dropped because of its strong religious connotations. And regarding, he has a little bit on the Prayer of Jabez, this bestseller. Alan complains, one searches this exceptionally thin book in vain for any statement that Christian prayer is an act of sacrifice in any sense. So there's a little bit of lament there, I guess, to the extent that I find his analysis compelling. I don't share the general, more or less upbeat tone about it. I want to make 2 or 3 other kind of comments and then close about this. Alan's book is based on his interviews with people and also upon reading a great deal of the ethnographic literature that he cites. And as someone who was trained more or less in a religious studies background and who has employed it in my own work, I'm not one to take after that method too strongly. But there's something to consider about religious studies and sociology of religion and those of us who are professional students of religion. One thing is we look for the interesting, the exotic, the out of the ordinary, or whatever. I asked Alan earlier before I'd actually read the book, did you do enough reading of the boring cases? And then reading the book, I realized that there's a smattering of some not boring but ordinary experiences, so that question's a little bit less sharp in this rendition. But still, I know that the literature itself tends to go after the exotic, tends to look at the kinds of aberrations from traditional religious practice, and so there may be a slight tendency to exaggerate the loss of what was considered once commonplace. I don't know, I just raised it as a question. The other thing is that some of the samples in the book are kind of in this direction. For example, 23% of Catholic parishes have charismatic presences, he notes, but 77% do not. I mean, you can cut this a couple different ways. Final thing to say on this kind of methodological point, it's really difficult to study religion. It's, I think, more difficult to study it than to study politics or history or other topics, because religion inherently is saying those religious actors that we study want to claim, look, we're dealing with something you can't fully understand or empirically measure or comprehend. We're dealing with the sacred, the holy, God. And your methods are agnostic, essentially. Your methods cannot, I mean, we wouldn't get tenure or very far if we said the Holy Spirit did it every time we explain, or the devil, or whatever. If we explain a complex human phenomena having to do with religion. On the other hand, how do you get at that aspect of religion which is dancing around almost every page in the book and in Peter's book? I'll give you one anecdote about this and then make a kind of concluding comment. Bob Orsi, a very talented historian and anthropologist of religion who's now at Harvard, was in Indiana for a number of years, wrote a very fine book called Thank You, St. Jude. And he's a wonderfully empathic researcher and writer, is Bob. And he was studying women, Catholic women in the 20th century who prayed to St. Jude. And their husbands were in World War II or at Vietnam, or there was alcohol problems or whatever it may be, and they gave money to and prayed to it, as Orsi puts it, imagine St. Jude into being. And as you read the first 9 chapters of the book, it's wonderfully, it captures their sensibilities and their attitudes. Chapter 10, he does his analytical piece, which doesn't allow him to get at this experience. He says, well, the harsh way to understand what these women were doing is that they were dominated by a patriarchal Catholic culture that had this St. Jude there to keep them in line. But I don't like that. I think the women were using their own agency and their own freedom in their relationship with St. Jude, and this helped empower them. But in both cases, Orsi has to say, they imagined St. Jude into being. And I ask him, What do your own interlocutors, what do these women say when they read the book or you tell them about it? They like chapters 1 through 9. They don't recognize themselves in chapter 10. They say, yes, this might be true. Yes, I guess it helped me cope with alcoholism. I guess it helped me cope with the loss of my husband or whatever. But, you know, there is a St. Jude. And you can't just put that outside of the explanation. I mention this not because to endorse the cult of St. Jude or to say that there is or is not, but that in the agency of religious individuals, getting at this element is so important, and yet it's difficult to get at with some of our methods. Let me just turn now in a concluding comment to contrast or comparison with Peter Steinfels' book on not just the crisis in the Catholic Church over the last number of months, but really it's a larger, more sweeping and detailed analysis of crisis in the Church over the last couple of decades, at least since Vatican II. What both of these books move toward, but I think not as successfully as I'd like to see, is some account of how did we get here? And Alan is not really trying to answer that question in his book, although he does make some suggestions. A historian, and that's my training, wants to know, well, how did we get to this point? What are some of the markers? Peter's book is somewhat more detailed in suggesting this, and you get a sense from Peter's book of the real struggle that Catholics have had over the last 30 or 40 years with a whole host of issues that are challenges to their faith, and precisely to this question of how do we stay true to the idea of God, of the sacred, of something that's not us, of a controlling, governing principle of authority in our lives that we ought not to let simply be conflated into the mainstream culture, that we ought not to confuse with everything else about the culture, that we ought not to be able to say the culture wins in every case. Peter does a very commendable job of looking at least some of the struggles, not only about women's ordination, the role of women, that's important, about the whole sexual identity issues that he mentioned, about religious freedom, the need for a greater sense of lay autonomy in the church. There are deeper explanations for these phenomena. One can point to transformations in this culture over the last 30 or 40 years in which we now live in a wordless world. And by that I mean a world in which the word, the spoken word, the capital T truth, the notion of a depth to reality is highly contested. Historians don't write narrative histories anymore. It's very rare because there's a sense, as a result of some very fine criticism of colonialism and of the use of language and myth and narrative to impose patriarchal white male will on subjected peoples, there's a real suspicion of narrative. There's been a building suspicion of the concept of a truth. There's been a kind of active nihilism in parts of the culture. I could go on, but I'm not going to. There are many other aspects and developments, really in the last 30 to 40 years in the country, that lead us to what Alan so skillfully describes, and also what Peter gives kind of a blow-by-blow description of. And I hope we will have time to discuss some of those causes in the period after the presentations. Thanks.
First, let me say I should have sat over there. Everyone's already said what I was going to say, but first I should say that the definition of a pundit, a TV pundit, is someone who can study brain surgery for 20 minutes and then deliver a lecture to brain surgeons on what's wrong with their profession. Okay. But I don't think it's on.
It's not on. Why don't you take the
Take
other microphone?
Take that one.
I am not going to be ignorantly dragged into a discussion of the Catholic Church, the turmoils of which I know nothing about. So I too am going to talk mostly about Alan's book. And first, let me say, I'm delighted that he's been on so much right-wing talk radio, especially coming from someone who wants sort of a review of a book of mine calling me not a true conservative. Now I know Alan is probably not really a true liberal. if he's going over so well on on these shows. Although if he had been a liberal or a true conservative, he would have called his book Treason: How Hillary Clinton is Ruining American Religion. And it would have sold a hell of a lot better, let me tell you. There's actually some truth to this. When he talked about religion light, I did sometimes get the sense that inside the body of that liberal sociologist, Bill Bennett, is screaming to get out. Because I think he's more judgmental about what's going on in religion than he knows. We're all in agreement about the reality of what's happening in American religion, in the American religious marketplace. And Alan is an academic, so he's a little more responsible. But I'll say it's squishiness. It's the softness of American religion, and especially of the evangelical community, which has gone squishy and soft over the past 20 years. First, I want to pay tribute to Alan for paying attention to the evangelical community, which is not something a lot of people, especially on the East Coast, overwhelmingly do, but he pays respectful and serious attention to the evangelical movement, even though he doesn't answer the central question about them, which is why they have such great sex. As you may know, evangelicals earn more than the average American. They're more educated than the average American. They start more businesses than the average American. But there was the University of Chicago NORC study which showed that evangelical women have more orgasms than any other group in American society. Now that's self-reported, but I don't see why they would lie more than anybody else. Nonetheless, if you go to a seeker-sensitive church or a megachurch in one of the fast-growing suburbs, what you see is only religion in name only often. These seeker-sensitive churches are, as Wendy says, personal service churches more than anything else. I began to notice this covering politics in the year 2000 in the southern primaries, when the Republican political operatives would observe that in elections past, you could go to the certain churches around the South, and you would find very conservative ministers who would rally thousands of voters. And organizations like the Christian Coalition and Moral Majority would rally thousands and tens of thousands and millions of voters. They got there in 2000, and it's been true ever since, and those organizations are letterheads only. The churches no longer deliver political votes. And that is because, for a number of reasons, one of which homeschooling. It was because of their unhappiness with the public school system that caused a lot of evangelicals to get angry about politics. And when 1 million people are homeschooling, the anger's gone. Second, affluence. As the community's gotten more affluent, it's gotten more happy and more complacent. And third, the cultural influences of the personal growth movements and the more relativistic, soft Oprah Winfrey movements, which have permeated the evangelical churches. Now when you go to the churches, you see a very, as Alan describes it, a very soft and relativistic service quite often. The political corollary to that was when George Bush was asked in 2000 who his most important political philosopher was, and he said Jesus Christ. He didn't say anything that Jesus told him. There was no content to that statement. It was pure identity group. I'm one of you. I'm a member of your community, but it was contentless. And I think that's symptomatic of the way the evangelical political movement has changed. Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, as Alan indicates in the book, are no longer representative of the evangelical community. It's become a softer, more relativistic community. Now, my view is, and exactly in accord with Alan's, is that this is American culture trumping what was a distinct subculture. And I have an explanation of why that came about. I won't bore you with, except to say that American religions, as to my reading, have always been individualistic, have always been non-doctrinal, have always been charismatic and more about sensation than about creeds and about firm belief. There's a great sentence in a book Henry Steele Commager wrote in the 1950s. He says, in the 19th century, religion prospered while theology went bankrupt. And I think that if it was true in the 19th century, it's certainly true at a lot of the mega churches you see around the country. I would say it has to do with the primary belief in America of personal achievement and the achievement of perfect happiness. And therefore you get this incredible emphasis on the divinization of the self and of individualism, and everything must serve the individual goal of achieving the higher happiness. But I won't bore you with that historical definition because as people were talking today, I wanted to get into two areas of disagreement and one area, to me, of true quandary. One, while as I've indicated, I think it's true that American evangelical churches and the evangelical political movements and religion in general have gotten softer and squishier and much more heterodox. I should mention it's also true of my religion, Judaism. I go to a synagogue in Washington, D.C., which there are many different, there's sort of a shopping mall of different minions you can go to in this synagogue. The one I go to is the one most young people go to, called the Traditional Egalitarian Minyan, which has about 300 very observant, very serious people in their 20s and 30s. About 10 years ago, it was a real meat market. It was sort of the dating scene for young Jewish Washingtonians. But these are people who study Torah, who know Hebrew, who keep kosher, who are very serious and want a very traditional service on Saturdays. And so you go in there, and though everyone's 40 or 30, they have shawls, and you think you're entering a 19th century shul. But one of the first times I went on as the sermon, or what we call the Dvar Torah, a young woman got up and read a story. And the story was about Isaac talking to the grave of Abraham, who had just died. And in the story, Isaac says, you know, since that day when you almost killed me, you never really communicated with me very well. And it was like you're in the shtetl and suddenly the Oprah Winfrey Show breaks out. And then you go back to the shtetl after that. And when I was researching a book, I ran across a rabbi in Montana, of all places, who was asked, what kind of Judaism do you practice? Are you Orthodox? Are you conservative? Are you Reform? And he says, well, I call it flexidoxy, because it's flexible, but it's Orthodox. And that marriage of traditional forms and traditional community with personal choice is a lot of what I think Alan is describing. But finally, the two criticisms I have, and I think what the points of debate are likely to be. First, I think he overstates things a bit to say that we are all melding together in sort of a non-judgmental post-culture war stew. The Episcopal Church is having its problems at the moment, which are quite confrontational and quite hot. The Jewish faith and the Catholic faith are also having clear splits between more conservative, less conservative factions. I think there's a vast cultural difference between the mood of secular blue America and the mood of less secular red America. And it remains true that income is a terrible way to predict your voting patterns. Social class is a terrible way to predict your voting patterns, but church attendance is a very good way to predict voting patterns. People who attend church weekly are 2/3 likely to vote Republican. People who never attend church are 2/3 likely to vote Democratic. So to me, there's still some sharp distinctions between church attenders and non-church attenders. And finally, as Wendy mentioned, we may be in a world where people are squishy and non-judgmental about religion, but we are not in a world where people are squishy and non-judgmental about politics, to say the least. This is the most polarized electorate pollsters have ever seen. There has been a sharp decline in split-ticket voting. One of the most interesting phenomenon of the American electorate to me is as voters get better educated, they get less independent-minded. High school educated voters are quite likely to switch parties from election to election. College educated voters are much less likely. Graduate educated voters less likely still. And that's because as you get up the higher in the education ladder, and when you ask people, are you liberal or are you conservative, they're much more likely to be able to answer that question. And once they place themselves ideologically, they vote straight ticket much more frequently. So to me, there's a very interesting interplay between what I agree with Alan is a non-combative discussion on religion and a non-judgmental attitude on religion and culture and personal values, and yet at the same time, extremely judgmental, extremely polarized, confrontational manner about politics. And I don't know why those two things are happening at once, but I think they are both happening at once, and I somehow do not think they're unrelated. Somehow what were culture wars have been transfogrified into wars about Bill Clinton or George Bush. And yet somehow those wars about the presidents cannot be unrelated to values. And then, so that, I think that's just a fascinating interplay of public debate. Then the final point, which those of us on the more pessimistic side of the table, I think share, is that Alan is way too happy about things how things are going. And I think deep in his soul he knows he is. No, I don't know. If your big fear in this country is religious fanaticism, then the softening of religious and doctrinal loyalties is good news. My big fear is not religious fanaticism. My big fear is that we'll become a complacent country that's like Nietzsche's last men, just mediocre, small ambitions, happy with our own comforts. And for those of us who think that's the big fear, and Tocqueville was one of us, religion is an antidote to that. Religion is an antidote to narcissism. Religion can be an antidote to self-love. Religion and the belief, or at least the awareness of true evil and true good, is an antidote to spiritual laziness. And if I'm going to go to church or synagogue or mosque or whatever, and it's just going to tell me how wonderful I am, then the hell with it, who needs it? And that's my basic attitude, and I would be much more unhappy, and am much more unhappy than Alan appears to be. Thank you.
I not only wrote a book, but I also reviewed Peter's book. So I want to just take the opportunity to say a few words about Peter's book, because I think David's comments really draw us directly back to the question of American Catholicism with which we started. And in fact, I think all the comments do to a certain degree. In my book, I quote a couple of people. One of them is the eminent sociologist Peter Berger, and another is the theologian Stanley Hauerwas, neither of whom is Catholic, but both of whom say that we ought to turn to Catholics for the true, authentic countercultural voice in America, that Catholicism offers and has offered throughout our history probably the greatest alternative to a culture of individualism because of the communal, the solidaristic traditions in the church. And that's why I was enormously taken with Peter's book, and why I think Peter's book is so important. Because Peter's book, it seems to me, like mine, but with much greater authority and with much greater knowledge of America's single largest religious denomination, looks at that institutional aspect of the Catholic Church and celebrates it while talking about its dilemmas in ways that I personally found enormously helpful and enormously moving. I work at, and my salary is paid by a Catholic institution. That's something that my parents probably never would have believed when they raised me, that would ever happen. To this particular Catholic institution and to the institutions of which it's a part, I have an enormous personal debt. I have just tremendous respect for Boston College, for the Jesuits who have been so instrumental to it, and for the students and faculty at this college and what they're trying to do. And as I was writing my book, I thought about, to some degree, this tension between these trends I was describing and the fact that I personally was enormously attracted and wanted very much, and was so honored and thrilled to be invited to come and teach on the faculty of this, to some degree, countercultural institution. Probably not countercultural enough for many people, but decidedly countercultural in an overwhelmingly secular university climate in the United States. And it's that kind of institutional aspect of the church that I think plays such an important role in Peter's book. For example, I think the part of Peter's book that had the biggest impact on me personally was his discussion of Catholic hospitals and a tradition of Catholic care, which I certainly know there are Catholic hospitals. You don't live in Boston and not know that, but it's immediately started thinking about that. You know, there are Jewish hospitals, but they don't play nearly the same role in the Jewish religion as Catholic hospitals play in Catholic life. And I don't even think anyone talks about Presbyterian hospitals, probably Lutheran. I guess there are Lutheran hospitals and so on, but the Catholic world and a world of institutions did really create an alternative culture in the United States. Sociologists and political scientists like me always talk about Max Weber's book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, but there's clearly been a Catholic ethic that's had an enormously huge impact upon the development of American life. And of all Americans' religions, Catholicism really did create a genuine alternative culture in its institutions, in its church life, in its ministry, and in the other institutions that it, to some degree spun off for that. So I wonder that if I'm right in my sociological account, will there be a particular cost to Catholicism? Will Catholicism pay, in a sense, a higher price than many other religions if it is so difficult indeed for religions to resist American culture? Not only will Catholics pay a higher price, but will I experience that price? Will my own life and the life I value and the life, I have 2 children at this institution, the world that they're experiencing, will that all be diminished as well? And so while I think what a lot of people have said about the optimistic and happy tone of my book is certainly there is an element of lament as well, which Scott Appleby picked up on. And when I think about that lament, it's specifically about Catholicism, where I see it expressed the most. And I wonder if, as we contemplate the changes in the church that are taking place before this sexual abuse crisis, and then when we factor in the sexual abuse crisis, will we be able to have a Catholic Church that will honor and continue and extend that legacy, that institutional legacy, and yet also be, as I think it must be, responsive to the modern world? Because if it extends that legacy the way it did at periods of Catholic triumphalism in the United States, I don't think that would be a particularly positive development as well. So all the dilemmas and all the contradictions that I try to talk about in my book, I think are sharper and more focused in Peter's book. And I think it's just an extraordinarily rich book because of its so deep sincerity and it's such strong recognition of really what's at stake when we talk about these issues.
I have nothing to add to that, except to tell Alan in regard to his debate about, with his editor about the title of his book, that while a People Adrift was my working title 5 years ago, we did have a certain moment when we thought we would call it Harry Potter and the Catholic Church. And I guess the only thing I would add before maybe others may want to comment or we could just open it up is the thing that I struggled with and that I see in Ellen's book as well is the problem of not simply having a treatment of tradition without internal distinction. I mean, Ellen recognizes the fact that there's never been a moment when tradition was not undergoing some kind of change. And yet I think we all do have the notion of the old-time religion, which usually the old time is about when we were 6 or something like that, or it's several decades ago or half a century ago. And I think that the real challenge is to recognize what changes in tradition are in fact faithful to the tradition. If a tradition that doesn't change becomes a fossil, if it's going to stay alive, there are going to be changes, and clearly there can be changes which are the kind of surrenders and diminishments that Ellen has very well documented in his overview of American religion. But the other hand, I want to say, well, we really have to look at some of those closely. In fact, is the bat mitzvah, for all of it being a 1922 and after phenomenon, in fact, a change in the tradition which really strengthens the tradition, which really is a way of bringing the tradition forward into a world in which we have a different understanding of the relationship between men and women and the roles of women. And in terms of the Catholic Church, again, it's from case to case, it's from issue to issue, where I want to ask myself, are we just surrendering to the kind of homogeneity, bland homogeneity that Scott referred to? Are we just buying into a kind of convenient New Age or self-help lingo that Wendy referred to, or are we contemplating alterations or modifications in the tradition which really are faithful to the traditions and our ways of, in fact, extending it into our own lives and into the future?
I just wanted to comment briefly on this rhetoric about the culture of individualism. I think, Alan, you've talked about it a little bit, and I always think it's something of a misnomer. You don't see individualism in the personal development tradition. You see self-centeredness and a lot of conformism, but you don't see individualism in the way I think of individualism. And I think that to the extent that American religious communities are taking on this personal development ethic, they're not taking on an ethic of individualism, they're taking on an ethic of self-centeredness and conformism. I like to think that at its best, religion is not anti-individual, that religion in some ways encourages individualism. If you think of individualism as being the ability to harbor convictions, to have the strength of your convictions, to act on convictions, to stand out from the crowd on a moral principle. What you see in the personal development tradition, and what you may see if some religions go this way, is not the strength to stand out from the crowd, but the desire to immerse yourself in the crowd.
From the audience, if you'd approach any of the microphones, there are 2 microphones set up. And if you have a question directed to an individual on the panel, please say so. Or if you allow anybody to answer your question, we'd be happy to do that too. So please. Gentleman in the back who's nowhere near a microphone. How's your voice, sir? Tolerable. It's good. We can hear you.
Okay. What I wanted to do was throw up to the panel for discussion a somewhat vague, but I hope not completely amorphous question. The discussion this evening has revolved pretty much around the question of what is religion to do, what is American religion to do, in the face of its apparent increasing absorption by a hegemonic secular culture. And what I want to ask about is the exclusive emphasis on the idea of culture as a set of ideas, and particularly a set of ideas about personal development. What strikes me is that nothing whatever has been said about the material component of American society which underlies this whole culture, a culture of, as I've just heard said, self-centeredness. To what extent, then, can the culture of self-centeredness be separated from the economy of market capitalism? To what extent can the idea of the culture we live in be separated from the material structures, and to what extent can the separation of religion from this culture be accomplished without some kind of critique of the material reality in which Americans live?
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead. Okay, I'll take a quick crack. I wouldn't say it's market capitalism, I'd say it's affluence. When the first people who came to this continent, the first white European people who came to this continent, came here, they were amazed by the abundance of the place. My favorite story about that is they found flocks of geese that were so large it took them an hour and a half to take off, and they would shoot cannon into the middle of the flocks, just to see if they could change the direction of these vast clouds of birds. that would cover the whole sky, and they found they couldn't do it. Their conclusion of that was that paradise is realizable here, that we are so blessed here that God's heaven on earth will be realized on this continent. And people like Cotton Mather and Jonathan Edwards were very explicit about that. What that did, according to the historian Zach van Berkovich, was to erase the distinction between the secular and the profane. The secular and the sacred. Berkovich has gone through all the sermonizing of the 18th and 17th century, and he says very early on, people thought that because paradise and God's fulfillment would be realized here, they thought there was no opposition between the abundance they saw all around them and their spiritual aspirations. Indeed, there was a confluence. And so to me, that is what is responsible for the incredible permeation of American culture and material culture into religion. If you go into churches and you go into a mega church, sometimes it seems all they're doing in a book like Prayer of Jabez is talking about making money. You go to the grocery store and there's Ben & Jerry's ice cream and a Whole Foods, organic grocery store, you think you're in a church because there's so much spiritual aura around. And it is that mixture of the material and the spiritual, which to me is an outgrowth of the mentality of abundance.
I'm a little uncomfortable with what we may be falling into as a kind of blanket negative characterization of our culture. I think there is a culture of self-centeredness, but there is also a culture of individualism and choice in the genuine sense that Wendy referred to a few moments ago. I think that market capitalism is very much part of the story. I think it's part of the story in terms of the homogenization of discourse and the deterioration of discourse in the public sphere. But I think there are other aspects that have to do with modernity in general, that have to do with the segmentation of life into different spheres where we work and have different professions and live by different standards, and our work, the economy and our neighborhood and our family are not all integrated. I think there are aspects that simply have to do with the pluralism of American life, which is, it's partly the result of the United States being the refuge for the persecuted of the world or for the ambitious of the world, and it's a source of enormous vitality. I think all these things come in, and I'm very much grateful for the question, because sometimes when I was reading Alan's references to the culture, I was interested in what he saw. If religion, just take the phrase about religion is not shaping the culture as much as culture is shaping religion. And I was wondering, what exactly were the forces that he had in his mind behind a phrase like that. So it's a very welcome question, but I just don't want us to fall into too undifferentiated a notion of our culture as a bad thing.
On the question of individualism, if I may, I had the experience twice now in the last year of hosting 15 Muslim scholars from scholars of Islam from the Muslim world at Boston College, and the purpose of these institutes, which were funded by the U.S. State Department, was to teach Muslims from primarily the Middle East, but also Asia and Africa, try to explain to them about separation of church and state, which is an alien idea in many ways in the countries in which they came from, and even more the idea of separation of church from culture. And so for 3 weeks, I talked about individualism, I talked about voluntarism, I talked about the Tocqueville, I talked about separation of church and state, I talked about how we don't have state-supported religions in the United States, about how they have to sort of do it on their own, and I really thought they understood. And then with one group, in the last week, we went on a field trip, and one of the places we went to was a very, very large mosque in Orange County, California, the Garden Grove California mosque. And the imam from the mosque, who was originally from Pakistan, talked to the group, and he said, well, we have a board of directors here, and we ask people, we have members of our mosque. You don't have members in a mosque in a Muslim country, but we have members, and they pay dues, and that's how we support ourselves. And one of them scratched his head and he says, you mean the government doesn't pay for you? And it was like the 3 weeks, you know, they finally understood. And it's that kind of individualism in the United States, the fact that we have this tradition, in a sense, that is at the heart of how we define religion, that I see as a very, very powerful part of our culture. And it's that kind of individualism. I don't disagree at all that a lot of what I described can be self-centered and narcissistic. In fact, I call it narcissistic. But there also is this healthier tradition of individualism in which kind of churches have to make it on their own to some degree in the marketplace. And every American religion will be shaped by that, ultimately, I think, positively. And it's a hope understood that everything I'm saying also applied to American Catholicism in the past, where coming from a country in which the Catholic Church traditionally was supported by the state to a Tocquevillian, voluntaristic society meant a transformation in the way religion was carried out and conducted.
Let's take another question. Go ahead, Bob.
I'd like to thank all the panelists for a fascinating evening, but I'd like to direct a question towards Peter Steinfels in particular. If I have it right, Peter, towards the beginning of your book, you make a somewhat provocative statement saying that the competing narratives which have marked or marred the Catholic Church since Vatican II have pretty much exhausted themselves, and that there's need to elaborate, come up with, work towards a new narrative. I guess what I'm not clear on is, to what degree do you think your book presents a new narrative? Or a perhaps not very benevolent critic would say, well, really, it's the old liberal narrative with a little more tolerance.
Yeah, that's a good question that I'm not sure that I have an answer to it. I don't think I would claim to have a new narrative. I think that I sketched out essentially 4 narratives of what the church had been struggling over since the Second Vatican Council. And my reason for doing that, for putting those narratives in, was to suggest that the same facts that are cited by liberals or conservatives or ultra-conservatives or radicals will read differently depending on what the larger story is in. And I just wanted to bring that to everyone, to my readers' consciousness, so that we're not just entirely arguing about this fact or that fact, but what is the dominant story. Now, I said there that my preference for the story was, and I then presented a kind of a brew of generally the liberal and not the radical position, with a little bit of admixture of several of the others. I think it would be fair to say that as I said tonight, I'm not writing from some kind of Solomonic neutral point of view, nor out of either a totally new narrative, some kind of synthetic, or one coming in from a completely different angle. I would actually welcome that, but I don't think I can do that. My position is fundamentally that of the moderate liberal narrative and the moderate liberal position on the spectrum of Catholic opinion, perhaps modified only by the desire to take more account of the opinions that are and the questions that are raised elsewhere. But I am, I think, vulnerable to the criticism that, you know, I have no totally new narrative, nor is it some sort of neutral narrative. I'd be interested, if Scott, if you had any observations on that, looking at it from.
I think what Peter's book has accomplished for us is to lay out, first you should say there's no escaping a position on the spectrum. Any kind of new narrative is going to immediately be cast according to our familiar categories. So I think it's almost a hopeless question, Bob, in some ways, that we're not at a moment where we can transcend these categories in any way. And I think Peter was wise not to try to do that, because what he has done, and maybe the reason I think he succeeded is because I share that kind of liberal moderate orientation myself. What he has done is, the word I think of about the book is equable. That is, it's difficult to find, I don't know what your most negative criticisms have been. I'd be interested to hear, so far, what have the criticisms been, other than the old canard that, well, it's coming from a liberal point of view. But what's striking about the book from my perspective is Peter's ability precisely in being able to articulate these different narratives, to incorporate the various points of view within the church and to allow for them. And I think as he analyzes the real struggles that face the Catholic community in the future, who's going to replace, just to connect this comment to the earlier comment, who's going to replace generations of religious, women religious and priests on the question of capitalism? This cuts across Catholic identity in so many ways. One way of which is when you have a whole cadre of people for generations who have essentially taken vows of poverty, they, in a sense, to some degree, provide a witness in the community against consumerism, against materialism, while providing a kind of thoroughgoing working group, a phalanx of workers who are educating, informing, and building institutions across the way. As Peter probes these various issues, he's not taking an ideological perspective. Rather, unless one would say the very act of including different possibilities and pursuing different angles of view on the question is itself liberal because it's inclusive. And if that's the criticism, then I think it's one should be proud of.
We have another question.
Alan Wolfe, in one of your concluding remarks, you gave a very eloquent tribute to the possibility of Catholicism being one of the key countercultural voices, and as Peter Steinfels said, to articulate effectively a consistent ethic of life across a variety of public policy issues. And I think even before the abuse crisis sprung upon us a few years ago in its last iteration, I'd be interested to hear the comments of the panel on how you think the media perceived or took on the willingness to take the Catholic Church seriously as a voice. Think about the pastoral letters that were done in the 80s, their consistent critique on different public policy issues, both domestic and international, because of leadership questions. Who is the public face of the Catholic Church? And so in your book, you talk so much about the evangelical movement, the rise, and then the frittering away, the squishiness of the evangelicals. I'm also interested in this question: why not more attention to mainline Catholics, mainline Protestants who go to church on Sunday in more traditional forms of worship but are concerned about public policy issues? And I would argue one of the main problems we have is the public face of the church is a bunch of white, older men, and women aren't among them. And that the church would be taken more seriously to enter into these debates if women and minorities were more of a part of the public face of the church articulating these positions.
Thank you. Alan, you want to defend the hierarchy?
Can I at least attack the media? I recall several years ago watching a mass on Easter from Rome, Vatican, and after the ceremony was over and the Pope had delivered his message, there was a television news person came on and said, "Nothing new here, Peter," as if the purpose is to come up with something new every Easter.
Well, there's our friend E.J. Dionne's experience when he was traveling with the Pope in Africa, and one day the press team was given all the papers for the Pope's many speeches that he was going to manage to give in a single day, and they went through them quickly and threw up their hands and said, "There's nothing here but religion."
Well, if I can say just a word or two in defense of the press, sort of, it's not only ignorant about religion. It's not as if religion gets some special dispensation. We're going to know less about religion than we know about other things. I don't know that the treatment of religion is all that different than the treatment of other complicated issues. And in fact, there was an effort over the last 10 years by a lot of newspapers across the country to beef up their religion coverage, to get more religion reporters. I think especially during the 90s when we were in something of a mini revival, that religion was getting taken a lot more seriously by the press. Now, what version of religion, you may ask? I mean, when Time and Newsweek have cover stories about angels and heaven and Abraham and Jesus, is that what you mean when you say you want the press to take religion seriously? You know, I don't know. Those articles do give you some interesting information about what a lot of Americans apparently are thinking about religion and religious questions, if you believe their surveys. But I wouldn't beat the press up about religion unless you wanted to beat the press up in general. And actually, from my perspective as a secularist, I think that the press is much easier on religion than it is on atheism or agnosticism.
And the question, of course, we should recall, really was only partly about the media treatment. It was about the public face of Catholicism. And I have argued, you know, and in a media culture, you're going to have to deal with what is the public face. I recently made a discovery that a body known as the National Pastoral Advisory Council, I'm not even sure of its name, which has an advisory function to the Bishops' Conference, that members of that body actually could speak at meetings of the Bishops' Conference, and they don't have any vote, but they actually could have voice, and there's nothing in church law that prohibits that, and that it seemed to me that simply on the level of the public face, if a variety of people who were not dressed in black with bald spots and gray hair, more or less like mine, but none on their chins, were the public face of Catholicism. But in addition to that, there were women and lay people generally participating, that would be significant just on that symbolic public way.
Just to add an element to that, you know, there is an African American male who is the leader of the Bishops' Conference. Would that it were an African American female, but still, this is a dynamic speaker. The problem was not only, or even, in my opinion, primarily, that there wasn't a spokesperson, because Wilton Gregory was an articulate spokesperson. The problem with the Catholic public presence is the bishops in the church are paralyzed at a time like that because there is no national leader. The leader is the Pope. And particularly under this particular Pope, there's a sense that there's one charismatic, authoritative leader in the church. He happens to be in Rome, aging, frail, and so forth. And the terrible period of time between January 2002 and who knows when there was any effective presence, but certainly not until April, and even then it was kind of a fiasco, was an enormous lost opportunity because the bishops clearly had no way to respond publicly with one voice authoritatively because they're all sovereign over their own diocese. Only the Pope can speak for all of them. So there are real structural problems with the church in terms of mobilizing any kind of response beyond the communications office of the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, which did its level best, but frankly isn't equipped to handle anything like that, and the people working in that office don't have the kind of moral authority that a Bishop Gregory would have. But he could not come out publicly in January or February and talk about what's going on in Boston with cardinal law. So it's a complex problem of church dynamics and the lack of a kind of clear, empowered authority in the church in this country to speak in any way for any other bishop.
We're going to have to call this to a close. In a short period of time, Boston College students will be rehearsing on this stage, singing and dancing their hearts out, and we will all be at home. I want to thank our panelists, Wendy Kaminer, Peter Steinfels, Alan Wolfe, Scott Appleby, and David Brooks.
Thank you so much.
And-
That went really well.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been a wonderful evening. I want to thank the Church in the 21st Century Initiative and the Wazi Center for sponsoring this. And I want to point out that Peter's book and Alan's book are for sale in the lobby, and I'm sure they'd be happy to sign copies and explain things in the book that you don't like or like. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.